Hi, this is Dr. Miller. This week I want to continue the study of deductive logic, that is, of the logic of deductive arguments. Last week we talked about one kind of deductive argument known as categorical arguments. This week I want to talk about a different kind of deductive argument, uh, one called conditional arguments. Again, let's begin with some definitions. A categorical proposition is a statement that asserts a conditional relationship between two states of affairs. What that means is basically it's a statement that says one thing is true if another thing is true. For example, if you miss your first serve in tennis, you get a second try. Or she won't pass the test if she doesn't study. So statements like these are different from categorical propositions, but notice that they can also be true or false. It is true that if you miss your first serve in tennis, you get a second try. On the other hand, if someone were to say, if you miss your first serve in tennis, you get a second try and a third try, that would be a false statement. Notice also that conditional propositions are compound propositions consisting of two smaller statements. One that states the condition and the other stating what happens if that condition is true. The one that states the condition, the if part, we call the antecedent. The one that states what happens if the condition is true, we call the consequent. So in the first statement, if you miss your first serve in tennis is called the antecedent in that conditional. You get a second try is called the consequent. And so now let's talk about what a conditional argument is. A conditional argument is simply an argument that includes at least one conditional proposition as a premise. For example, consider this argument. Premise 1, if the battery is dead, then the car won't start. Premise 2, the battery is dead. Conclusion, therefore, the car won't start. It's a conditional argument because premise 1 is a conditional proposition. So the antecedent of that conditional proposition is that the battery is dead. The consequent is that the car won't start. Now, what I want you to notice about this argument is that premise 2 asserts that the antecedent is in fact true. The battery is in fact dead. And the conclusion of this argument is that the consequent must be true. The car won't start. So the question we want to ask here is this argument valid? Well, as we did with categorical arguments, we need to look at the formal structure of this argument in order to determine whether it's valid or not. But we do it a little differently with conditional arguments than we do with categorical ones. Here we want to replace the smaller statements, the antecedent and the consequent, with letters instead of terms as we did in the categorical arguments. So let's let P stand for the antecedent, the battery is dead, and Q stand for the consequent, the car won't start. So the first premise we would symbolize if P then Q. The second premise is simply an affirmation of the antecedent, so let's symbolize that by saying the battery is dead, P, and then our conclusion is therefore Q, therefore the car won't start. So the question is this a valid argument form? Well, to determine that, we would need to see if we could find an argument of this form that had true premises and a false conclusion. And we could look and look and look and look, and we would never find one. So this tells us that this is in fact a valid argument form. Any argument that has this form is a valid argument, meaning if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And that includes the argument we're looking at here. Now let's look at a different argument, a different conditional argument. First premise, if the battery is dead, then the car won't start. Same premise as the previous argument. Second premise, though, is different. The car won't start. Conclusion, therefore, the battery is dead. Now let's again ask, is this a valid argument? To answer that question, we have to, once again, look at the argument's structure, look at its logical form. So let's again let P stand for the antecedent, the battery is dead, and Q stand for the consequent, the car won't start. In this case, this argument, the second premise we would simply represent as Q, because what it's affirming is that the consequent is true. And the conclusion we would represent as P, because it's affirming that the antecedent is true. So we have an argument of the logical form, if P then Q, Q therefore P. Now the question is this a valid argument form? Is it possible that there could be an argument of this form whose premises were true and whose conclusion was false? Well, if you think about what's being said in this argument, it certainly could be that this argument would have true premises and a false conclusion. Just because a car won't start, that doesn't mean that the battery is necessarily dead. It could be a faulty ignition switch, or a car could be out of gas. So if you think about one of those scenarios, you can see that this argument would have true premises and a false conclusion. That tells us that the argument form is invalid, that it's possible for the premises in an argument like this to be true without the conclusion also be true. And if it's an invalid argument form, then that means any argument that has this form is invalid. This is an example of what we call in logic the fallacy of affirming the consequent. It's a fallacious, that is deceptive form of argument. Seems to be good, but isn't. In this case, the fallacy comes from the fact that what's affirmed in the second premise is not the antecedent of the conditional, but the consequent. Now let's look at a different argument. If the watchdog detects an intruder, then it barks. The watchdog didn't bark, therefore it didn't detect an intruder. Is this a valid argument? Well, once again, let's put it in formal terms so we can look at its structure. The thing to notice here is that the second premise is a negation or denial of the consequent. Instead of affirming the consequent, it denies the consequent. It says the watchdog did not bark. And the conclusion of the argument likewise negates the antecedent. The antecedent was the watchdog detects an intruder. The conclusion of the argument says it did not detect an intruder. So we symbolize this, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So once again, the question is this a valid argument form? Well, yes, it is. There are no arguments of this form that have true premises and a false conclusion. And since it's a valid form, that tells us that all arguments of this form are valid, including the one we're looking at here. Now let's look at one more conditional argument. If the watchdog detects an intruder, then it barks. The watchdog didn't detect an intruder, therefore the watchdog didn't bark. So notice here that the first premise is the same as the one we had in the previous argument, but the second premise is different. It's a denial of what is stated in the antecedent. It's a negation of the antecedent. And notice also that the conclusion is a denial or negation of the consequent. So we could show this as having the form, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And once again, the question is this a valid argument form? So the question we have to ask is whether it's possible that you could have an argument of this form that had true premises and a false conclusion. Well, the answer is yes, you could have an argument like that. In fact, just imagine this very argument under a somewhat different scenario. Imagine that the watchdog is barking at the moon or barking at another dog that happens to be in the vicinity. Then it would be true that the watchdog didn't detect an intruder, but false that it didn't bark. So you would have true premises and a false conclusion, and that tells you that all arguments of this form are invalid, that the premises of an argument like this could be true without the conclusion being true, and therefore this argument in front of us is invalid. This is also a fallacy that has a name. In this case, it's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent, because premise 2 is a denial or negation of the antecedent of the conditional stated in the first premise. So in conclusion, let me just summarize what we've learned in this tutorial about conditional arguments. First, there are two valid forms of conditional argument, those you see on the left here. And second, there are two invalid forms, those you see on the right. The two invalid forms have names. The first one is called affirming the consequent, the fallacy of affirming the consequent. The second is called the fallacy of denying the antecedent. My suggestion is that you simply memorize these forms as valid and invalid, respectively.